The moment Avarian's attorney stepped into our all-hands meeting, everything inside Cloudport shifted. No warning. No announcement, just two men in dark suits walking straight toward our chief executive officer with a folder thick enough to end a career. Brett, our chief executive officer of 7 years, stared at the papers as if they were written in another language. His voice cracked as he tried to laugh it off. Is our partner joking? He already knew the answer. My manager, Holland Price, stood a few feet away. I watched the color drain from his face as he flipped through the contract packet the attorney handed over, page after page, until he reached the signature line. My name sat there in clean black ink. I did not need to be close to see the moment recognition hit him. His fingers twitched. The folder rattled. His mouth opened, then closed again. The lawsuit was not about server issues or vendor delays. It was about my unpaid royalties. I kept my arms folded and my expression steady. No one was looking at me yet. They were too focused on Brett stumbling over his words, too shocked to process that the contract detonating under them had been written by someone they rarely acknowledged unless something needed fixing. I could have enjoyed the silence a little longer, but I turned inward instead, letting the moment settle into my bones. How did one missing raise request lead to this, to lawsuits, accusations, and a room full of executives pretending they had no idea what Clause 9.4c meant? Let me show you. 2 weeks earlier, I had stood in human resources while a woman named Dana smiled at me like she was apologizing for the weather. Your raise request has not reached us yet, Lorena. Maybe it was a routing delay. Her tone was light, harmless, almost warm. But I already knew the truth. Holland had lost it again. The same way he had lost it last year and the year before that. I remember nodding politely, walking out of her office, and feeling the humiliation burn low in my stomach. Quiet, sharp, unmistakable. But underneath that humiliation rose something steadier, colder. Something that finally made sense. This time, they had pushed me too far. The story you're about to hear is a fictional work created by the writing team at Her Revenge. It draws inspiration from the injustices many women face in the workplace: disrespect, favoritism, and age bias against midlife professionals. We tell this story to highlight the journey of a woman who rises, reclaims her worth, and refuses to let anyone define her value. This narrative is meant to inspire, heal, and remind you that self-respect is never something you ask permission for. All characters and events are purely illustrative. I walked back to my desk that afternoon, knowing something inside me had shifted. And once it shifted, there was no going back. Cloudport liked to pretend our contracts wrote themselves. I used to joke about it with the junior analysts, though the joke was never funny to anyone but me. My title, Senior Contracts and Intellectual Property Analyst, sat buried 3 layers down on the organizational chart. But every major deal that kept our company alive had passed through my hands. I was the one who built the licensing frameworks that protected our software. I was the one who negotiated the indemnity language no one else bothered to read. Yet in meetings, Holland would gesture vaguely at me and say, Lorena handled the technical bits, as if the entire legal foundation of the enterprise were a footnote. One afternoon, an intern named Clara stopped by my desk with a nervous smile. Holland said you saved the Avarian deal, she said. He told us to study your structure. Across the room, Holland was laughing with the director. When he noticed Clara talking to me, he raised his voice. Clara, remember, big picture thinking matters most. Lorena is fantastic with details, but strategy is a different skill set. Clara's smile faltered. She walked away before I could respond. When my mother's oncology bills started climbing last spring, that detail work was what kept us afloat. That was why the raise mattered. I had stayed late more nights than I could count, eating vending machine crackers while drafting clauses that protected millions in assets. Holland would pat my shoulder on his way out the door. You're a lifesaver, he would say. We'll take care of you next cycle. Next cycle never came. 2 days after HR claimed my raise had not reached them, I sat alone reviewing my own approval log. I had never checked it before. I had trusted the system, trusted the chain of command. But trust only works when the people above you have something to lose. My name appeared on the form, my request appeared on the form, and then nothing. The routing record showed the request had been opened by Holland, then manually removed from the queue, not delayed, not misplaced, deleted. I stared at the screen until the edges blurred, realizing the truth I had avoided for too long. If they could erase my raise, what else had they made disappear? I pulled the Avarian Master Agreement from the archive, the way someone might open an old diary slowly, wary of what the pages might say back. I had written this contract during Cloudport's leanest years, when our leadership promised equity we could never afford and asked me to get creative to close deals we had no business winning. The Avarian Defense Logistics deal was the biggest of them, up to $100 million over a multi-year performance cycle. And buried inside its 60-page royalty schedule was the protection I had built for myself without fully realizing I might one day need it. Clause 9.4. See? I read it once in silence. Then again, slower. If Cloudport Systems meets the agreed uptime and data processing milestones for 3 consecutive quarters, the intellectual property architect of the licensed framework, herein identified as Lorena Caldwell, shall receive retroactive royalty compensation. The milestones were printed clearly. So was my name. 18 months ago, Cloudport hit every metric, the engineering updates, the performance dashboards. Even Brett's quarterly brag sessions proved it, yet no one had notified me, and no one had paid me a single cent. My throat tightened as I traced the signature lines. Brett's name, Avarian's counsel, and mine. A soft tap landed on the doorway of my office. Holland leaned against the frame with that familiar practiced ease. Digging through old files, he asked. Those legacy contracts are nightmares. No one reads half of what's in them. I kept the document flat on my desk. This one seems important. He gave a casual shrug, but something flickered in his eyes. If it were important, I would remember it. He did remember. He had seen this clause years ago. He had dismissed it because he never believed I would check. When I folded the contract shut, my hands were steady. The truth had weight now more than the pages. More than the years that had passed since I wrote them. Holland had not just erased a raise. He had buried a royalty clause worth millions and hoped I would stay quiet. I spent Saturday in my small apartment with my laptop open, folders spread across the table like pieces of a crime scene. Every document, every metric, every line of evidence had to be airtight. I started with the performance dashboards. The numbers were irrefutable, 3 consecutive quarters of uptime above the threshold Avarian required. I whispered each metric aloud as I checked them, letting the truth settle deeper into me. Then came the data volume logs. Avarian's traffic had exceeded 5 terabytes again and again, each timestamp unmistakable. Brett had bragged about the numbers in his quarterly reports. Record-breaking reliability, he had said in front of the entire leadership team. I pulled those transcripts too. His confidence was preserved in neat paragraphs. By midday, I shifted to human resources. The raise request they claimed had never reached them was still sitting in my archived system records, marked as removed by approver. I took a screenshot of the timestamp, then another and another. Each one tightened something inside my chest, not rage this time, but clarity. Holland had never planned to send my request forward. Not last year. Not this year. He had built a pattern, a quiet one, hidden by polite smiles and empty promises. When I opened my email archive to cross-reference contract drafts, I found something else. A forwarded message from 2 years earlier. Holland had taken a pitch deck I wrote at dawn after an all-night vendor review and sent it to the executive team with a simple line. Here's my proposal. He had removed my name. He had removed my version history. He had stamped his signature at the bottom. My hands did not shake when I saved the file. I looked at the evidence piling up, the truth layering itself piece by piece, and something inside me settled. I was no longer trying to defend myself from a lie. I was preparing to reveal one. The question now was not whether I had enough proof. It was who deserved to see it first, the company that ignored the danger, or the client they had quietly endangered. By Sunday afternoon, the evidence filled an entire folder. My cursor hovered over Marcus Vance's number for a full minute before I pressed call. He picked up on the second ring, his voice low and steady, the voice of a man who had negotiated billion-dollar defense contracts and walked away unscathed. Lorena, he said, it is the weekend. Should I assume something is wrong? I found a clause you and I wrote together years ago, I replied. Clause 9.4c. It triggered 18 months ago. I was never notified. And Cloudport never paid the royalties owed. He didn't interrupt. I kept going. The uptime metrics were met. The data thresholds were exceeded. Every milestone was achieved. And Cloudport continued licensing your framework without compensating the architect named in the contract. That architect is me. Silence, not confusion calculation. When Marcus finally spoke, his tone had sharpened. This violates Everion's indemnity structure. We only use vendors who maintain clean licensing. If your royalties were withheld, Cloudport is out of compliance. I know. It also exposes Everion to federal procurement risk, he continued. If the licensing is invalid, we are effectively running unauthorized software inside defense systems. That is not a small concern. I know that too. Another pause. Longer. He exhaled once, sharply, like someone acknowledging a threat they had always suspected might come true. Then his voice softened in a way I had never heard. Lorena. Thank you for calling me first. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the relief pass through me before it hardened into resolve. What happens now? I want to see the documents, he said. Bring everything you found. Tomorrow morning, Monday, Marcus replied. 8 o'clock. At Cloudport, no, he said. Come to Everion's downtown legal office. This conversation belongs on our ground. When the call ended, I sat with the quiet that followed, knowing something essential had shifted. Marcus Vance did not invite people into his office unless he intended to act. By 8:30 Monday morning, I was at my desk when the first ripple moved through Cloudport's internal chat. A message from the chief executive officer's assistant appeared in the legal channel. Everyon sent something urgent. Forwarding to leadership now. Seconds later, Brett forwarded the message to our general counsel with a casual note. Handle this, probably routine. The audit letter was anything but routine. Everion's legal department demanded proof of valid licensing, confirmation of all royalty payments owed to the intellectual property architect me, and a full audit within 48 hours. The email hopped downward like a stone skipping water. Chief Executive Officer, General Counsel, Finance Director, Manager. Finally, it landed in my inbox. Holland appeared beside my cubicle 2 minutes later, holding his coffee like nothing unusual had occurred. Draft a compliance response, Lorena. Do not overcomplicate it. Just send Everyon something reassuring. I kept my voice even. I will need to review the original royalty schedules before I reply. He waved a dismissive hand. This is all legacy noise. They probably flagged some outdated clause. Give them a standard acknowledgement and move on. I nodded once. He mistook my agreement for obedience and walked away. He did not know that Marcus had warned me about the 48-hour deadline. He did not know the audit had nothing to do with outdated clauses. He did not know Everyon was already preparing the next step. An hour later, a message popped up from Kevin, one of the younger analysts in finance. Lorena. Did you see the contingent liability flag? Something about royalties before I could answer. Holland leaned into the finance channel. Delete it. The system misreads old data. Reclassify as error. Kevin hesitated. But it references active contract language. Delete it, Holland repeated, the warmth gone from his tone. Now. I watched the notification flag removed. The room stayed quiet, but a line had been crossed. They expected me to fix what they had broken, to protect them from the truth once again. Instead, I opened a new folder, saved every message, and prepared to let the clock run. The 48-hour window closed on Thursday at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I watched the timestamp roll past on my screen and did nothing. No draft, no reassurance, no attempt to soften the blow. At 5:03, my phone buzzed. One word from Marcus proceeding. By Friday morning, the first sign of impact hit the finance channel. A message from accounts receivable blinked at the top. Everyon payment suspended. Reason pending compliance review. Moments later, the shouting began. Chad, our chief financial officer, stormed into legal's workspace. Why was this not addressed? Everion's payment is half our quarterly revenue. Greg, the general counsel, lifted both hands. We never received the detailed request. Ask Lorena. She drafts the responses. I stood, calm. You forwarded the audit to Holland, who instructed me to take my time. I have the email if you need to see it. Greg's jaw tightened. That is not what I meant, and you know it. Chad spun toward me. Lorena, why did you not respond? Before I could answer, a new message notification flashed from Kevin, the junior analyst, who had hesitated earlier in the week. He had BCC'd me on an email to the chief financial officer. per instruction from Manager Holland. I deleted the royalty liability flag, confirming here for record. I saved it instantly. Chad read the message aloud, his voice cracking. He ordered you to delete a liability. Are you out of your mind? Holland stiffened. It was a system error. She is twisting this. She was standing 3 feet from him, holding every thread he thought he had cut cleanly. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I simply met his stare and let the silence settle. Something changed in the room then, not fear recognition. I was no longer the person they overlooked. I was the person they could no longer escape. By Tuesday morning, Cloudport's leadership was desperate to regain control of the narrative. They scheduled an all-hands meeting, promising clarity and unity, words that usually meant nothing but sounded heavy in the air. I stood near the back wall while Brett, our chief executive officer, lifted a microphone and forced a smile. Our partnership with Avarian remains strong, he announced, pacing the stage. There have been misunderstandings, but we are addressing everything proactively. The doors opened before he could finish. 2 men in dark suits entered Federal Process servers. Behind them walked Marcus Vance, calm as a surgeon entering an operating room. The room fell silent. Brett blinked rapidly. Marcus, is our partner joking? Marcus stepped forward. Avarian does not joke about federal procurement violations. A gasp rippled through the employees packed shoulder to shoulder. The process servers handed Brett a stack of documents thick enough to bow in the middle. Brett fumbled through the pages, flipping faster as his breathing grew uneven. Marcus continued, his voice carrying easily across the room. Cloudport has been operating Avarian's licensed framework without a valid intellectual property license for 18 months. Your unpaid royalties to the architect render the contract void. Avarian is issuing immediate termination for cause and seeking damages. The words hit harder than any shout could have. Next to the stage, Holland snatched the contract packet from Brett. I watched his eyes lock on the clause, on the signature line he had ignored, and then on my name printed clearly beneath it. His hand trembled just as it had in my memory of that first moment. Employees turned. Whispers rose. Confusion spread through the room like static. Chad swore under his breath. Greg rubbed his temple. Brett sank into a chair, stunned. I stayed where I was, silent, steady, letting the truth settle around us all. The power they had dismissed for years was no longer invisible. The boardroom felt smaller than it had ever seemed. Brett sat at the head of the table, shoulders hunched. While Holland kept folding and unfolding his hands, Chad, the chief financial officer, stared at the surface of the table as if it might crack open and swallow him. Greg, our general counsel, looked exhausted, his tie loosened and his eyes red around the edges. Marcus placed his briefcase on the table and opened it with deliberate calm. We can begin. Brett cleared his throat. Lorena, let us be reasonable. We can remedy the oversight. A retroactive raise 10%, maybe more. Let us fix this internally. I set a folder in front of me. This is not about a raise. Brett. Greg leaned forward. Human Resources failed to route your request. It was an administrative error. I slid the printed log toward him. It was removed by Holland. That is not administrative. Holland jolted. You are twisting it. I was cleaning the workflow queue, Marcus cut in. Shall I read Avarian's findings aloud, or shall we proceed with the terms? Silence settled again. Marcus placed a document in the center. Cloudport must pay all outstanding royalties and penalties owed to Ms. Caldwell. Full licensing will be restored once payment is complete. Cloudport must also acknowledge the compliance breach in writing. Chad shook his head. We never deleted the liability flag. I opened Kevin's BCC email and pushed it across the table. Brett read it, paled, and did not look up. Greg made one final attempt. Lorena may be misinterpreting the clause. It was never intended. Marcus interrupted him, tapping the contract. Her signature identifies her as the intellectual property architect. Intent is irrelevant. Brett exhaled a long, defeated breath. Fine. We will sign. The pens moved slowly, each stroke tightening the consequences around them. When the last signature landed on the page, Marcus closed his folder. The surrender was complete. I folded my hands and waited for what came next, no longer afraid of the path opening in front of me. The wire reached my account on Wednesday afternoon. The number filled an entire line on the screen, months of unpaid royalties, penalties, and interest compiled into one transfer. I let the breath leave my chest slowly. It would change my life. Yes, but it was not the part that stayed with me. What mattered came afterward. Late that evening, the board issued its formal corrective actions. Brett received a polite but unmistakable notice he would be removed from all day-to-day operations and remain only as a ceremonial figurehead until his contract expired. He did not argue. He simply nodded. As if he had been expecting the fall, Holland's consequences arrived the next morning. An HR representative read the findings aloud in a closed session, documented deletion of evaluation records, misrouting of compensation requests, and willful suppression of a flagged liability. The board placed a 5-year restriction on his eligibility for any leadership position within Cloudport or its partner entities. Holland stared at the table, silent, as if the words had finally caught up with him. Human Resources was ordered into a full operational audit. Dana approached me afterward, her voice low. "We should have looked into this sooner," she said. "I am sorry, Lorena." I nodded, offering no comfort. Some lessons required discomfort. 2 days later, Kevin knocked on my door, clutching the promotion letter I had recommended. Senior Compliance Analyst. He read softly. "You meant it. Every word," I told him. "Now do the work the right way." The board offered me the director title I had once dreamed about. I declined. Instead, I accepted a role that allowed autonomy, oversight, and the authority to build systems that protected people who did not know how to protect themselves. No more vanished requests. No more buried clauses. Before leaving for the day, I wrote one final note in my personal log. They did not lose my raise in legal. They lost their entire foundation the day they underestimated the woman who wrote it. Keeping your worth quiet does not mean surrendering it. Silence is not weakness. It is the space where strength gathers its evidence, chooses its moment, and writes an ending no one can take away.